Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next instalment of Net Zero Week, where we have a keynote session now on advancing offshore wind energy, a very topical discussion. I keep repeating myself, I keep saying topical discussion, but then all of the discussions that we're having seem to be extremely topical at the present time. And so that's great. My name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction journalist. I also contribute to um, Climate Perspectives magazine, which is a magazine that covers a lot of the events that we organise, like Net Zero Week. And as I said just a second ago, this is a session on offshore wind energy, and we're going to be exploring the future of offshore wind in the company of an expert panel. I think it's fair to say. Our speakers are Raya Peterson, who is head of Offshore Wind Advisory at the consultancy Ramboll, who are also one of the sponsors of Net Zero Week. And he's going to be discussing a range of issues around this question, including how the contract for differences model has enabled offshore wind to play a key role in Britain's progress in decarbonising its electricity mix. We've also got excuse me, we've also got Steve Jermy, who's CEO of Celtic Sea Power, who's going to look at the potential of flow technology going forward. And we've also got Beate Hildenbrand as well, who's going to be talking about a range of issues, including how we ensure that this sector actually makes a real contribution going forward, and also the critical need to expand the wind workforce in particular by, I think it's up to 1 million workers within the next decade. So a very important area there. And we know that we're going to be discussing skills in more detail in the following session of the week as well. So a lot to get through, a lot to discuss in this particular session. As I said, our first speaker is Raya Peterson, who's the head of Offshore Wind Advisory at Ramboll. He leads Ramboll's global offshore wind project development and advisory team, with a particularly strong focus on the UK, the US, and Central Europe. He's got more than 15 years experience from successfully leading and supporting diverse technical and commercial advisory services for investors, lenders, and developments within this sector, with really quite a lot of involvement in offshore projects. So I think he's got quite a detailed understanding of what's required in this sector. So Raya, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy. I'm happy to kick us off here. Maybe a little bit of an introduction. I think offshore wind has come a long way in the UK. It's actually was one of my first projects that I ever worked on in 2009, a London Area project, quite a long time ago. I think a lot of progress has been made in the UK in decarbonising the electricity mix over the past couple of years. Renewables have significantly increased their share. Coal has been phased out. And I think in particular, offshore wind related, the UK has been a fantastic market. It's the second biggest market out in the world. Only China has recently surpassed it. But there's still lots of work to be done. I think the power sector currently is on trajectory to be at net zero by 2050. Obviously, the now incoming government has set an ambitious aim to get to that by 2030. Offshore wind is supposed to be quadrupling. Lots of efforts behind that. So far, the CFD mechanism is unique. It was first introduced in the UK in 2014. Has since then been expanded also to other markets. And one of the key benefits is that it provides developers with a stable and clear revenue, which they can use to finance their projects. And that has always been one of the pivotal points in the UK, driving down the costs of offshore wind by almost 70% since its inception. However, I think last year we had a bit of a a hiccup. I think those working in the industry knew it and saw it coming, but then everybody was still surprised that it in the end happened with 0 bids on the last allocation round, obviously meaning that quite a bit of capacity is now missing in the UK. And I think we now, and I look forward to discussing that also with my fellow panelists here today, what's in store for now for AR6, which should come here shortly, and what do we see and how do we actually get on track to meet this goal of 50 gigawatts by 2030, which is quite significant. And I particularly look forward to seeing what you, Beate, have to say in terms of skilled workforce, which is one of the key elements. And also, Steve, what you'll be sharing in terms of floating, which is obviously, I think, one of the key things in the UK that we're looking forward in terms of expanding the offshore wind footprint. So thanks for the opportunity and look forward to the panel.
Thanks very much, Raya, for that, and we'll certainly return to the points that you just made in your opening contribution. Our second speaker in this session is Beate Hildenbrand from G+, which is the Global Offshore Wind Health and Safety Organization, where she is head of the Americas region. G+ is the global health and safety organization that brings together the offshore wind industry to pursue shared goals and outcomes. It's run in partnership with the Energy Institute, which provides the Secretariat and supports its work. A little bit about Beate. She has a background in geography, started a career as a scientific project manager in atmospheric research and data modeling before she became technical manager for environment and health at the Energy Institute. She joined G+ in 2018 as manager for offshore wind and supporting them in the delivery of their work program. I think it's already been pointed out by Raya that one of the issues that I think Beate is going to be talking about is the skills question as well. But she can talk about that far better than I can. So Beate, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andy, for the introduction. So my name is Beate Hildenbrand, head of offshore, head of the Americas for G+, but I'm wearing actually today 2 hats because, as you said, the G+ works in partnership with the Energy Institute, and I'm actually stepping in pretty last minute for my colleague Lydia Malley, who was supposed to speak on and who's heading up the Learning Academy at the Energy Institute. But health and safety in offshore wind, I think, is key. And I would really talk a little bit more about making health and safety part of the business case in offshore wind and look after a very well skilled but also sustainable workforce in the industry. And I think therefore it goes very, very much hand in hand, the work that G+ is doing with the main tier 1 developers, owners and OEMs, but also the work the Energy Institute is doing in really to attract, develop and equip diverse future workforce, and also to inform industry, inform decision makers and enable the industry to come to net zero, to make energy lower carbon, more safe and more efficient. And that's why I'm really delighted to join the panel, to also introduce a little bit what we can do. And for me, I'm a key believer in cooperation with other organizations that include stakeholders, regulators, supply chain, and to bring it all together and to work in particular on the interfaces, because this is where the bottlenecks are, where we need to do more work, but there's also a potential for risks and for safety, where we jeopardize safety to achieve the things, and we are pressured to come to that net zero goal. So very happy to join this panel today. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Beate, and we do have and will have some questions around the issue of skills and health and safety going forward. Our next speaker in this session is Steve Jermy, who is the CEO of Celtic Sea Power, which is an arm's length Cornwall council company promoting the industrial development of Cornwall's floating offshore wind, that's FLOW for short, sector. In Steve's first career, his experience included diving offshore aviation, underwater operations, fishery protection, and also the command of 4 ships and senior appointments in the MOD's policy departments and in Afghanistan. In his second career, he worked for Mojo Maritime and James Fisher Group on flow, wave, and tidal energy projects. He's also chair of the Celtic Sea Cluster as well. Steve, over to you.
Andy, thank you for that introduction. And thank you also for the invitation to be here. It's terrific to be on this conference. 5 quick introductory points from me. Firstly, floating offshore wind. What is it? Essentially, it's large turbines that are conventional turbines, but on floating platforms. Why is that important? It allows us to access much deeper water than ever before. In the conventional offshore wind sector, we run out of depth at about 50 meters, and it won't surprise you there's a lot of deep water out there. So the size of this potential market is probably at least 4 times or 5 times the size of the conventional offshore wind market. What does a floating offshore wind turbine look like? Well, there's a range of different floating foundations, but fundamentally they're big. So the planning figure that we use is a 50 megawatt turbine, which has the same vertical extent as the Shard. What does that allow us to do? It will allow us to move at scale and speed. And I think it's important to understand in this conference that offshore wind is the workhorse of the energy transition. In Cornwall, our biggest onshore wind project, is about 20 megawatts. That's tiny in the offshore wind sector. So at the moment, we're looking to get 5 gigawatts worth of capacity out into the Celtic Sea by 2035. We've been operating to a clear strategy. Started in 2019, so we worked in the first phase to get policy engagement successfully. That allowed us to actually work with Westminster and Whitehall to create the market, which meant establishing a CFD, as Raya has talked about, and also a pipeline of projects. And I'm pleased to say that in the Celtic Sea, we are one of the 3 largest pipeline of floating offshore wind projects in the world, the other 2 being Scotland and Oregon. What are we doing now? We've moved on from developing the market to industrial development. 3 lines of action in that. The first is that we're working in a systems way to make sure that the consenting and planning processes are streamlined as possible and that they don't slow down the industry. Secondly, we're working on long lead items, which essentially means issues where we need to get investment now and develop capabilities so that they're ready for the early 2030s to meet the targets that we've got to meet. 4 long lead items: ports, the grid, building the local companies so they have the capacity to do what we need to do, and lastly, but by no means least, the workforce. And it's just worth thinking about what we've got to do. 4.5 or 5 gigawatts in the Celtic Sea by 2035 means that we have to put a turbine in from the late 2020s, which is the size of the Shard, every 1.5 weeks for 6 years. And lastly, Celtic Sea Power, what are we? We're owned by Cornwall Council. I won't talk about our history, but what makes us different is that we are public sector owned, but operating with a clear industrial development remit. That means that I've got a team of mixed people here. I've got engineers, a couple of mariners, scientists, and so on, project managers. And our aim is systems-led industrial development. We're regionally anchored, so we have an office here in Cornwall and also an office in Pembrokeshire. And that allows us to take a systems approach and not look at just building the industry, but rather building the whole ecosystem which the industry can thrive. And if we can do that, we think there's a very large chance that we'll actually be able to secure the jobs and the local value that this great industry can produce. That's me, Andy.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that. We're going to dive into the questions now because I've got quite a few. And I want to start off with one for Raya, and that is, given that the last contract for differences auction round didn't get any bids, how do we ensure that in allocation round 6, AR6, how do we ensure that we avoid a 0 bid outcome in that particular round? What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andy. I mean, I think it's it's less likely that we will see a zero outcome now, because obviously the most pressing thing that has been done is the strike price has been lifted, right? I think this maximum cap that has prevented people from bidding, because they basically said we cannot make any business case at this level, that has been lifted a little bit. But I think what we have to really look to is what we measure AR6 to be a success on. Is that just because we received the number of bids, or can we receive the maximum amount of bids? And that's where I still have a little bit the struggles with, because there are certain measures in around how the CFD mechanism is built that go beyond the strike price, that ensure that this pot that is available in terms of funding is also utilized to the maximum degree. And I think it's simple things like, what capacity factor do you assume for the wind farms? Because you have to make a projection of, if I award this wind farm, the CFD, then how much of that pot will be used by that wind farm? And it's very, very influenced by what amount do you give in terms of strike price, but also what do you assume this wind farm will actually generate over the 15-year lifetime of the CFD? What is the electricity price going to be during this time? And these assumptions really influence how many wind farms can you, let's say, support with one pot. And I think if we are seeing at the moment assumptions being taken that are reflecting really the worst of worst cases. So that means the pot will only be able to support very few wind farms. And what would then, if you take more reasonable approach to the assumptions of development of electricity price as well, because if the electricity price, let's say, goes up, then actually we'll be paying much less in terms of subsidy, because the strike price difference between strike price and electricity price will be less. Therefore, you could support more wind farms by taking, I would say, more reasonable and not this worst case assumptions to protect, obviously, the ratepayer. That is what's behind that. But I think we have to weigh a little bit off about how much offshore wind do we want to support. We really need to maximize the pot in AR6. And I think there's still a little bit of an opportunity to look at that.
Can I add something?
Yeah, I was just going to bring you in on that, Steve. Yeah.
I think there is one big picture issue which is rarely discussed in the discussion about the last round, which is that actually two significant input costs have gone up. The first is the cost of capital, and the second is the cost of energy. So we've been at historical low cost of capital, historical over all time low cost of capital, and that has started to increase. So that's bound to increase developers' project costs. The second is the cost of energy has gone up. And it's not obvious to a lot of people, but it's obvious to me. One of the key input costs for all of the renewable sector is the cost of oil and gas, because our supply chains are critically still dependent on oil and gas. That too has gone up as a result of events in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I think what we are hopefully seeing with the central government is an understanding of the realism needed to take these factors into account. Because without those, there is no project developer in the world who will bid to make a loss on a CFD. So we need to understand those input costs. But if we do understand those input costs and are prepared to adjust as the government seems to be doing, I guess this new administration will, then all should be good.
Yeah, and I think, Steve, maybe just one response to that, because I think the cost of capital is in really an essential part, and is often overlooked in this discussion. People always complain and say inflation has increased the cost of the turbine and the cost of the foundation. What has really happened is the cost of capital has gone up, and capex intensive projects like offshore wind farms are just, the increase in cost of capital over the last couple of years has just outnumbered the increase in the cost of the components, I believe. And that is really, and I think the CFD mechanism, why I'm such a big fan of it, it's actually really an enabler to go for the lowest cost of capital, which is still project finance. And that has been really the backbone of offshore wind for years, that companies went for low cost debt project finance and enabled these projects to be financed in that means. And I think the CFD mechanism can do that again. I think we make some amendments to it a little bit, like, for example, also allowing people to more flexibility to go for maybe corporate PPAs and such. But we really need to make sure that they can get access to the lowest forms of capital.
It's worth, as a sort of final bit of this, Andy, that the reduction in the cost of offshore wind energy over time, a third of that reduction has been due to reduction in cost of capital.
Thanks both for that. And I think also on this cost of energy issue as well, obviously it remains to be seen whether they achieve this, but it's clear that the new administration have placed a high priority on doing what it can to actually facilitate those costs coming down. And actually, there's a political imperative there, in my opinion, for them to actually succeed on that, both domestically and in a commercial sense as well, because it's all linked in. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Another challenge, though, and I know this to be the case, is the whole area of skills in this area. And I just want to return to Bayer and ask, what are the biggest challenges facing the sector, the renewable energy sector, when it comes to its workforce, in your view?
No, absolutely. And it is a challenge and a bottleneck. And I mean, listening all to, I'm not a financial person, but it's always listening to these financial plannings. I think it's crucial. And I mean, obviously, we need to make it happen with the demand in offshore wind coming to net zero. We all agree that we need it. We see a lot of work going on worldwide, and it's a time of the year when you usually see the reports getting published by GWEC, who bring up the numbers. Also, the Energy Institute has just published their statistical review of world energy, and you see there is a lot of development. There's a lot of construction going on in offshore wind in various parts of the world, but we know we need to get more done. So, for example, in the IRENA report, it's given that 75 gigawatt offshore wind capacity is installed globally now, but by 2050 we need to increase this to 2,000 gigawatt in order to meet the net zero. And other reports also say that we need, especially not only the supply chain is really essential, that we really need have a bottleneck here in supply chain, and therefore this obviously all needs to get in these plannings and enabling the projects, that they're not bidding on a low cost price and then not think about how about getting these bottlenecks solved. And that's why I said in my introduction, safety needs to get into the business case and needs to get in this, be part of it. And now I come to the skilled workforce, because obviously once we have the projects up and running, and from a very early stage, we need people for the development phase. We need people then obviously in the construction phase and further on in the O&M phase, so across the whole life cycle. Different skills, different workforce is needed across this life cycle of offshore wind, and people need to be trained and equipped adequately to do a safe job and also a sustainable job, because I think in the early days it was not looked really in the sustainability of the work. We need to keep the workers healthy. We need to keep them safe, because if we see incidents, and the G Plus is gathering all these safety for performance data from our members and do the statistics, and we see not major incidents like in oil and gas, but we see incidents. We have a higher rate of incidents, and we need to get this down to save the industry from starting from the reputation, but also to keep up with the pace industry is going. And so it's the workforce, occupational health, process safety. We need to look into. We need to catch up with the new developments of technology, like Steve said, floating wind. Yes, again, we need to look into this, and we need to catch up. And I think this is where the cooperation comes into play with regulators, with industry worldwide. It's a global industry, so we all need to work together to achieve this.
Thanks very much, Bayer. I'm going to return to Steve.
Yeah,
You mentioned hang on a minute. You mentioned when you spoke earlier about the need for the consenting and planning process to be more streamlined. And there's an interesting question in the chat about that, about how consent will be impacted by local communities going forward, and how we should address and manage this to ensure projects progress and enable a just transition. What's your view on that, and how do we? I mean, there's been some encouraging noises from the new government around planning. How do you view that in the context of offshore wind?
I think, well, the thing with offshore wind is you've got sort of the onshore and the offshore consenting, and the sort of the onshore consenting is not dissimilar to any renewable energy consenting. Offshore is quite different, and what we've been trying to do is we're in a situation where we've got a slightly chaotic system. So we have a planning system which is run by the Marine Management Organisation. We have a seabed leasing system which is run by the Crown Estate. We have a consenting system which is run back again. You go on to the MMO, the Marine Management Organisation, and so on. And it isn't designed, I would say, charitably with a systems view. So what we're trying to do is to help that out. It includes, for example, coordinated data gathering, so that actually we're starting to build a data pool which is right for the developers, but also right for the statutory consultees. We're looking at the timescales in which it's not just consenting, it's the whole planning system. And if you look at AR1 through to allocation round 1 through to allocation round 3, the average time of a British offshore wind farm being developed has gone from 7.1 years to 13.1 years. So we've been going the wrong direction. But a lot of that, I think, is taking a much more strategic approach to how we work in the offshore waters and how we do that planning. I could talk at length about onshore, but I think it's the offshore bit which will interest your audience. And I think the way to do that is to say much more strategic and better working together between the different government departments who are responsible for one or other of bits and pieces of that planning, consenting and leasing process.
Yeah, and just a kind of a follow up on that as well, because you know the whole thing around planning. I mean, I find it hard to understand, but maybe I'm just an anorak. But I think some of these projects look absolutely stunningly beautiful, actually. But I can understand why maybe people who live close to them are, can be worried about the environmental impact. How, in your view, should we minimise the impact on the environment? Particularly floating offshore wind technologies, but the whole sector as a whole.
Yeah, I mean I'm an anorak as well, Andy. So don't worry, you're in good company. I think that the great advantage that floating has is that we're a long way offshore. So it's rare that you will actually see these turbines from offshore and from onshore, and that removes one of the big issues with planning. When it comes to the environment, in fact, to go one back, I would say the key entities with which we deal are the MOD, the fishing community, and the environmental community. And just taking the environmental community, it would be wrong to say that there won't be an environmental impact of putting offshore wind turbines in. Of course there will. However, in my view, I think it's quite a nuanced situation, because once they're in, they essentially become marine protected areas because you can't fish in them. And from experience elsewhere, such as Raya was on the London Array. I have a colleague I know well, Peter Crone, who was part of the London Array team, and he said that actually fish catches either side of the arrays have actually increased because of the lack of any fishing within the projects themselves. You can also do quite a lot to either install in an environmentally neutral or even an environmentally positive way through, for example, the use of concretes that can be tuned to attract fishing, and the use of other seabed techniques where once the project's in the water, it becomes very much the sort of ecologically positive at best and at worst ecologically neutral use of the seabed in the project area.
And Andy, if I may just respond to that, because I think it's also a topic that's quite dear to us at Ramboll, because we've put the whole kind of sustainability aspect as part of a core element of the company. And I think we do quite a bit in this topic of, call it nature inclusive design. But I mean, I think in particularly on fixed bottom, you also see eco innovation, and you see lots of areas where this actually the industry has moved from, I would say, being green by default and we're building an offshore wind farm. That's a green sustainable thing to do. It is now evolved to actually what can you do when you build that wind farm to make it even more nature inclusive? How can you look at recyclable blades, which are a huge topic? We are seeing green steel move into becoming, let's say, the first few projects that are using this in towers. In 2-3 years, we will be here, and this will be the quasi-standard that if you build an offshore wind farm, you have to take that into consideration. I think we are down the line going to be looking at what these vessels that install them use in terms of fuel, how can we reduce their emissions. So I think it is really at the heart of the industry to make the industry more sustainable by default. And I think it's an important step, and we are moving in the right direction in terms of that. However, it comes at a cost, right? So I think this is the flip side to this, and I think we have to make sure that while we do all these measures, we take into consideration that we cannot have declining costs of offshore wind forever, right? At some point, we will reach some kind of plateau. We are very much at competitive with all the fossils. If you take into account all the actual real costs of fossils, then I think we are by far the lowest electricity generation technology out there, but we will not see costs go down forever. And I think this is the fine line that governments now need to walk also when talking to society and making this acceptable to society, that it does come at a cost to change our electricity system.
Thanks,
I can
Raya.
only, sorry, just to chip in, I can only, agree with everything said. And I think it's really important to come to the communities and to get the engagement with the communities. And like Steve, you said in your opening, it has so much benefits also that brings to the community and job creations. It can bring really, uprise certain areas. So, but I think it's really key to get everybody engaged and everybody involved. And I mean, we see these issues around the globe. I'm looking after the Americas, also fishery industry, tribes. You need to engage and you need to take the time, and that lengthens the process, of course, and then again increases the cost. But I think if we all work together in communicating an engagement process, this will also over time pay off.
Yeah, I think that concept of a joined up approach in terms of how you leverage the different benefits of the industry as a whole, individual technologies, the opportunity for skills development as well, is one that I really hope, particularly in the UK, the new government is actually going to embrace, because I think there's a real opportunity there. I think maybe in the past we haven't operated in a joined up enough way, and I think we really need to do that. And I think it's a natural way to work anyway, given the partnerships involved in the sector. I just want to return to Beate for a second, and wearing your kind of Energy Institute hat. I know one of the missions of the Institute is to attract and develop and equip the diverse future energy workforce. What skills and experience can people working in more conventional energy bring to the offshore wind sector?
It's over the year I've been involved with offshore wind. It's already happening, the transition from even companies former with having a history in oil and gas joining the offshore wind market and bringing their expertise. What I think is very beneficial, and therefore obviously people who worked in oil and gas business have certain qualifications that are very beneficial for offshore wind as well. But I think there needs to be the openness and also the understanding offshore wind is not doesn't equal exactly oil and gas operations. So there are significant differences in how it's operated, how it's designed, how it's set up. So I think there needs to be an openness in that there are differences. It's not it's the same only because it's offshore. There needs to be adaptation. But I'm really actually delighted to see that there is much more cooperation between the traditional only offshore wind renewable businesses to work together with oil and gas, because there is a lot of skill sets, especially, I mean, I come with a background from health and safety in human factors, organizational factors, that where the renewable industry can learn from and needs to adapt it. And obviously there is a lot of skills that can be from planning, managing projects, from that side, where there is an easy fit to transfer this. And I think that's where we need to work for, with the demand in workforce and skilled people. We really need to resource people and make them transferable, not only from oil and gas or into offshore wind, but also maybe between onshore wind and offshore wind, and also between projects. So to really help with standardization, harmonization of standards and processes. So this again is something the industry needs to work together and to move forward together.
Steve, just turning to you for a second, and I know you had your hand up, but feel free to chip in on something else. But I just wanted to ask you, while it's fresh in the memory and flowing from what B has just said, how should we maximise both the economic development but also job creation benefits of floating offshore wind projects?
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about workforce, and I may just come back to that, Andy. But to pick up your question first, the way there is a sort of two views on this, I think, and there is what I call a general economic view, where people say, if you're a project developer, you have to invest in social value. And the social value can be through the creation of jobs and this and that and the other. We take a slightly different view here. We think that the way to maximize social value is to make sure that we have extremely successful regional industries which are sustainably anchored in the regions and employing local people, and the social value falls out of that. So it's about building that. Now, one of the metrics on this is local content. So how much at the moment, I think if you look at a British offshore wind farm, on average, about 42% of the work is undertaken by British companies. The remainder goes abroad. We think we can do better than that. So there are ways which you can do this in terms of adjusting policies, mechanisms within the context of the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's equivalent. But I think it's equally important to actually just make it better to do things locally. There are so many advantages if you can do things locally. We did some modelling on this a couple of years ago to look at the cost of a floating offshore wind farm done internationally or locally. And it was a little bit more expensive to do it if you maximise the British input, but it was half the carbon cost, because of course you weren't importing things from China and that sort of thing. So, if I may just go back a little bit about the workforce, what we've done here to look at workforce is that we've done something which appears quite novel, but isn't. We've built a workforce model. So we've taken a 500 megawatt wind farm, worked out from other analysis what sort of people we need in that wind farm to build it throughout its life and then maintain it. And then scale that up into a model which allows us to forward forecast. And that allows us to we now have a very good understanding of what we need through into the 2030s in terms of the workforce. So we understand the demand. What we're also starting to do now is think about how we engage with, and indeed we are engaging with the HE&F, higher education and further education establishments, so that they too understand the demand and can help supply that demand. But it's not just about people, ab initio people coming out of the schools and universities. It's also about sideways entrance people. And I agree with Beate. The offshore oil and gas industry is a natural bedfellow of ours. So too is the marine industry. I come from a naval background, and so too is the wave and the tidal industry. And those really are the natural bedfellows. That's not to say that onshore people aren't welcome offshore, but it's a very different environment working offshore, very different, with a very different culture. So I think it's important that people who do come from onshore to offshore have the right courses and the right sort of cultural adaptation to allow them to work in a very different and much more challenging offshore environment.
I'm going to come back to Raya in a minute, but I just want to quickly quiz you on something you just mentioned there, Steve. And you talked about how you've done some investigation into the cost of UK versus, overseas, I suppose, manufacture. So on that basis, then, in your view, will the UK look to manufacture the next generation floating turbines, or will it be relying on imports?
I'd be interested on Raya's view on this as well. I think it's unlikely that we'll manufacture the turbines. When you look at the overall cost of an offshore wind farm, it's about 37% of the turbines themselves. And, the three key manufacturers are General Electric, Vestas and Siemens, and increasingly Chinese manufacturers. Should we build turbines here? I'd love to see it. And I've never really quite understood why the natural British industries who could do it aren't doing it. Rolls-Royce is a good example, I should have thought. They're not, though, for the moment. So what we've got to do is, as best we can, is pick up the rest of it, the balance of plant, the cables, the anchors, and the foundations themselves, because there's a hell of a lot more. And then, of course, the operations and maintenance, because we're talking about operations and maintenance, which will run for the 25-year life of the project. And let's assume that we repower those turbines. Well, we'll be probably looking at 50 years. So we're not looking at creating jobs here. We're looking at creating careers.
Yeah, that's a great point. Raya?
Yeah, I was just going to react to Steve, your comment on my view on building things in the UK. I mean, it's always been a little bit mind-boggling for me that you have such a huge market, you have so little, let's say, and you always had a market that's been so predictable and so long-term big in terms of goal, but you never really had a local manufacturing to the extent that for the size of the market. I personally think, I mean, we need smart industrial policy to enable this, right? I mean, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. I think we need a similar mechanism in Europe. What we need to get away from is thinking that, trade restrictions or import taxes and stuff will protect us. We need smart industrial policy that will support us as Europe, including UK, to be a hub for green, similar as China has done it, right? China has done this some years ago, and they supported it with policy, and now they're exporting EVs, they're exporting solar panels, and they're looking at exporting wind turbines to the global market or even building facilities somewhere. We need something similar, and I think in floating in particular, we have the chance because they are the structures, as you also said in the beginning, Steve. I mean, they will be so significant in terms of size that actually building them close to the site will be much more, let's say, maybe not economical, but if we look at it from CO2 footprint and these kind of aspects, then we have the opportunity to actually making it attractive to build these in the UK. But I think it takes us looking beyond, I think, the way we've maybe looked at the market in past years of bringing the cost down and such. I mean, the moment we, for example, would have a measure of measuring an offshore wind farm in its carbon footprint against another offshore wind farm in terms of its carbon footprint. And you would basically say, well, I mean, the components that are built locally and not shipped all the way around the world, they give us a better carbon footprint. We need to reward that. How do we figure out a mechanism to do that? It becomes a win-win. And I think that is also how you get people on board, right? I think that is the most important thing is we need to get people on board behind this, because if society as a whole will not support transition, then I think we can have a lot of panels and discuss and say this is the right thing to do. But if people are not behind it, I think we won't manage. And I think this jobs and creating them inclusiveness and giving them the opportunity, I think is really what we need to do in order to get here and stay on track.
Thanks, Raya, for that. Obviously, there's a target to reach the 50 gigawatt goal by 2030 in the UK. In your view, Raya, what are the main challenges towards achieving that? And crucially, how will we overcome them?
I think Steve touched on a few of them already in the beginning, right? I mean, it's ports, it's grids, it's companies, it's workforce, it's all those things. So I think we need to scale up on all aspects. And I think really important is that we create certainty. And we clearly don't have a start-stop. I mean, the US is a good example, and Beate, you probably know it in terms of their production tax credits, right? You look at their wind market, it kind of goes like this all the time. Every time you have a PTC extension, then people are gung-ho about the market, and then it goes down and people go away again. I think we need a clear target. This is where we're going, and then we need long policy that puts us there so companies can make the investments that are needed, because at the moment all we have is big targets And we know an industry that's saying, well, if we want to meet those targets, we need to make investments, but we don't have the investment security in order to make the investment. So I think at the moment we're talking about the chicken and egg problem. And I think this is really something that we need to overcome.
Yeah.
Steve, I mean, just on that, I mean, clearly this sector is really, really important in the transition. I think you called it the was it the workhorse of
Yeah.
obviously. So given that's the case, and given what Raya just said, both from the conventional offshore wind, but also floating, which is obviously your area of particular expertise as well. How do we make sure that that's actually not just seen as important, but is actually expanded, delivered upon, so that we can meet these all important targets going forward?
I think, I mean, I think actually, if you look at the maths, it's obvious, and let me give you an example. In Cornwall, we're probably one of the leading onshore renewables counties in the country. And we started the first British offshore wind farm in 1992. And so far, it's taken us 30 years to get to around about 200 megawatts of onshore capacity. So it's 30 years. And if we continue on our current trajectory, we will hit net zero in the year 2260. So it's clear that with offshore wind, you can move at scale and speed, and that's the difference. I think the way to do this is to take two particular bits, but I strongly agree with Raya on industrial development. We need a clear industrial strategy. We're seeing a bit of that in what's called the Industrial Growth Plan. But I also think that we need to really involve the regions, and the regions have tended. You've generally in the past talked about the industry and government, and we've left the regions out of it. Whereas if the regions are involved, they know their regions, they know their companies, they know where they've got shortfalls, and if we can involve the regions in a trilateral discussion and give them devolved capacity, then I think that's the way to do it. We do need that policy stability that Raya's talked about as well. And frankly, we have not been too bad on it. We've been a little bit up and down, but if we've got that policy stability. But I would also say that probably the last bit of this, and I was involved in a discussion on this only 2 weeks ago. It was a non-political discussion, but one of the things that we all agreed, all from this industry and some of the biggest players in the industry, was we need a long-term plan. We need a long-term plan where people can see how that plan works out. That's particularly the case for offshore wind. And I think that that plan needs to take a systems approach. So look not just at building companies, but building the whole ecosystem, to making sure the grid's ready, making sure the ports are ready, making sure that the workforce is building at a time so it meets the needs of the industry. Making sure the industry's capacity is built. And if we've got a long-term plan which uses a systems approach to industrial development, then I think we've got a chance. But I would not underestimate the challenge of hitting 50 gigawatts by 2030.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I just want to go back to Beate. We talked about the need to develop a skilled workforce. I mean, in your view, what's the importance of educating those all-important other stakeholders like investors, policymakers, and communities on offshore wind for the long-term success of the sector?
No, absolutely, and I think we stressed this before, that it's key for the sustainable and long-term success. It's really key to involve everybody and inform everybody and bring everybody together and engage in it. But maybe for a last comment I would like to make, because obviously I'm wearing today the skills hat and also health and safety hat. I think what we haven't talked about is also mental health and well-being, what is actually very important to us as well. And we had a study actually done here in the UK with a HSE involved on the mental health. And I think what came out is really that offshore wind operations are not so much different to any other jobs in similar industries, but it's really the challenge is is a safety of or security of the job. So I think really that long-term planning and to have a plan in place and have a structure in place is very important also for that health and well-being factor, and security of the job security, leadership. So that's something also we can learn from across the board, and skills are very needed in not technical skills but also leadership skills in the companies, and this is really important, also to have a sustainable long-term workforce, but skilled people in all the elements you just mentioned, Andy.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, which I knew we would do in this discussion. Interesting that Steve mentioned in his last contribution about the need for a kind of a regional approach. As we sit here now, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister are in conflab with all of the metro mayors around the country. So hopefully that might be a sign that some of this kind of stuff will actually be further up the agenda. I mean, you can't get much higher up than the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister. So let's cross everything as far as that's concerned. And also, I'm drawn to a comment, not a question, that was put in the chat earlier from Heather, who said that anything is possible if we keep motivated to implement these changes, not procrastination. So I think that's a good way to finish. Just do it, and let's keep the pressure on government and obviously on ourselves as well, because we know that this is absolutely necessary for the nation's future. It just remains for me to thank all of our panelists. I'm really grateful for your insights this morning. Steve Jermy from Celtic Sea Power, Raya Peterson from Ramboll, and also Beate Hildenbrand from G+. Many thanks for taking the time out to join us at Net Zero Week, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at the next session for those joining it at 11 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.